This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to the Hindu's In Focus podcast. I am Nivedita. The premise of biofortification of crops is simple. When a population's diet is limited in iron and other vitamins, the consumption of biofortified crops can help improve micronutrient intake. Governments across Asia and Africa are hoping that these crops can help end hidden hunger or micronutrient malnutrition. Biofortification is the process of adding micronutrients to humble staple foods like rice, wheat, maize, millets, and the cassava plant or tapioca. India too is leaning on this agricultural practice. In August, Prime Minister Narendra Modi released 109 high-yielding, climate-resistant and biofortified varieties of crop at the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in New Delhi. So, how can India make the best use of this process? And what are some of the challenges associated with it? It is my pleasure to introduce our guest for the program, Sunita Kadiala, Professor of Global Nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me, Nivedita.
So, Professor, biofortification is a new term for us. Can you explain what it is?
Yes, biofortification basically is a process by which we can increase the amount of micronutrients in food crops. Why do we need to do that? Because about 2 to 5 billion people in the world do not have access to micronutrient adequate rich diets. And micronutrients are vital for our existence. They're important for our immunity and longevity, ability to fight disease, and they're also important for our cognition. So we want populations that are well nourished, including with vitamins and minerals. So when people are unable to access diets, foods that are rich sources of these vitamins and minerals, we need processes through which we can augment their intake with the nutrients they're currently deficient in. So that's why biofortification has risen to the fore as a solution, an important solution to fight micronutrient malnutrition, which is also termed as often as hidden hunger. So the process through which the biological mechanism actually for biofortified crops is quite simple. Biofortified crops are the crops that basically are trying to improve the micronutrient content of the nutrients that the population is deficient in. These tend to be, for example, iron, zinc, vitamin A, and so on. So the process of breeding the crops or improving the uptake of nutrients into those crops is the process of biofortification. For example, in India, these include rice, wheat, sorghum, and legumes. So we want two things here. The first is the crop that we choose to select for biofortification process should be widely consumed by the population, because we are trying to address a population-wide issue here, deficiency of these micronutrients. And two, we have to breed them with the micronutrients that the population is deficient in, so that they are able to consume these foods, these widely consumed foods, and then they can get these iron, zinc, and provitamin A, and so on.
So, biofortification can be done both genetically, like the case of the golden rice in Philippines, if I'm not mistaken, and through conventional methods, right, like through selective breeding. In we don't do GM. There's been a long history of protest for and against GM in India. So, how is selective breeding done in India? What other methods are they using?
Yeah, I mean, so there are three ways of biofortification, as you rightly pointed out. One is the genetic modification, and the other one is through agronomic practices. That means, the actual everyday practice of how we grow crops, and then through conventional plant breeding. Examples of course, successful examples of biofortified crops include, as you said, lysine rich maize, high pro-vitamin A rich cassava, for example, or the golden rice, pro-vitamin A rich rice. However, as you said, in India, we don't, the law doesn't allow sale of genetically modified crops. So this is not a process that we use at all in India. Another way is, for example, application of fertilizers or fortified with micronutrients, for example. It's one of the simplest methods among actually all the biofortification methods. For example, some studies show foliar spray of iron as an effective way to promote iron concentration in rice grains. Similarly, when soils are low in zinc, the crops grown in that soil will also be low in zinc. Therefore, we will have lower consumption of zinc eating crops grown in that context. So, studies have shown the application of zinc fertilizer to improve zinc concentration in crops such as maize. In India, we have, of course, many such examples of such practices, but success of these is largely variable due to difference in mineral mobility, mineral accumulation among plant species, soil compositions in that specific geographical location of each crop. Then there is also related flooding and soil erosion that may pose challenges to these practices. But however, agronomic practices remain an important component of biofortification. The one that you mentioned is increasingly widely used, which is the conventional breeding for biofortification. Basically, it means that the parent lines with high nutrients such as zinc or iron or a provitamin A are crossed with promising recipient lines over several generations to produce plants with the nutrient content that we want in that. For example, it could be iron rich pearl millet, it could be also iron rich or iron and zinc rich cowpea, and so on. This is the most commonly used biofortification process in India. And for this to be successful, we need sufficient variation in the genetic pool of these various traits. But India has been quite successful in breeding these crops. India has invested quite heavily in developing capacities within the country to do this process through our national agricultural research institutes, that is this, including the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, and also in partnership with multilateral institutes such as the Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research, which is now being called One CGIAR, and with its program Harvest Plus and other such centers. So actually, we have already released several conventionally biofortified crops in India. As I've mentioned several times already now, these include high iron-rich cowpea, iron and zinc-rich pearl millet, iron-rich sorghum, zinc and iron-rich wheat, and so on. And many are in the development to release pipeline currently.
So, is it safe to assume that each kind of how plants are biofortified, it'll change the process? So, supposing if they're spraying a fertilizer, that will have a different efficacy compared to the selective breeding one.
Yes, I mean, so that's the ones we need to test, right? Or we are testing is in the process of one is there are various stages to it. One is how much of what we're breeding or spraying goes into crops. And then is the crop taking up, is that uptake of that nutrient efficacious? That means, are we expecting it to, does the amount of nutrient uptake happen the way we anticipate and hypothesize? And it's not enough for the crop to have enough nutrient content. When we eat it, it needs to be bioavailable. That means it needs to be absorbed into the body, and the nutrients need to be absorbed into the body. So all these processes need to happen. So, in the context of biofortification with conventional breeding, there are studies. There have been massive number of studies. Well, I would say a good number of studies for various crops to ensure that all this pathway from breeding to this bioavailability and then the nutrient status is indeed strong, right? That's when we want to promote and take it up as a public policy. So, for example, we know that orange fresh sweet potatoes promoted in many parts of Africa. That means these are sweet potatoes which are staple in many parts of Africa, are fortified with provitamin A, beta carotene, which then gets converted into vitamin A in our body. So they have been tested for improvements in vitamin A status in human populations. And so these, for example, in this context, this example I'm providing, orange flesh sweet potatoes are not only efficacious, but also at a population level, that is, they're effective. That means that population level nutritional outcomes improve. So that is the kind of scientific inquiry that goes into ensuring that we have the right solution to tackle the problem of micronutrient deficiencies.
I like to take a sharp turn to economics for a second here. So, anything will be successful only if people are able to buy it, and if the farmers are able to grow it and see a profit. Are biofortified crops profitable for farmers?
Right. So I just want to take a broader look at cost effectiveness, which is what I suppose you're talking about here. So the first, from a larger problem or solution perspective, these interventions that reduce micronutrient deficiencies are among the highest value for money investments for economic development. And it is estimated that for every dollar USD invested in biofortification yields an average of $17 again USD of benefits in reducing the disease burden associated with micronutrient deficiencies.
Sorry to disturb you here. It is for every $1. It is $17
Yeah,
worth of
it's
investment.
1/7 in benefits, right? Yeah, I mean, so it's a really good investment to make. Like most nutrition investments, I would argue. No surprise, given that I'm a nutritionist, but many studies show that again and again. And actually nutritionally deficient diets are the top risk factor for all cause disease burden, morbidity and mortality, right? Illness and death. And so investments in micronutrient malnutrition can improve health of populations. And why does that matter? It matters because, well, we value people for our children. We would want our children to live a life to their fullest and realize all the potential that they have, both from a health perspective as well as a cognitive perspective, although they are, of course, interconnected. And improve, reduce the disease burden and reduce morbidity, and also and avoid premature mortality in these populations. But your question is it profitable for the farmers, and can people actually afford it? There are two sides, right? There has to be a supply and there has to be a demand. First is we are, I think, on an upward trajectory on the availability of these seeds of vines to the farmers through our public channels. But in India, I think we do have the investments have started, but we have some way to go in terms of research and development, where we are advanced to actually getting these seed inputs to the farmers at a time that they need, at the price points that they need, consistently, not like we are able to give it one season but not the next season. So it should be basically an off the shelf input that they're able to take up. A lot of education needs to happen. People need to know what these seeds are, why they should grow it, why they should change anything that they don't know anything about, right? This is a new seed. that's a very high risk investment for the farmer. So there has to be a lot of support that needs to be given to farmers in terms of ensuring that any risk to their productivity is minimal. So that is the supply chain to uptake of the crop issue. Another thing that is, even regardless of the amount of training we give to the farmers, these new seed varieties and the crops that they grow will have to have the same agronomic traits or even better ones. For example, drought resistant varieties. Maybe a farmer is using drought resistant variety today for their rice and an iron fortified or wheat, and a biofortified crop also needs to be drought resistant and also needs to be nutrient rich as well. So it has to match up at least to the current traits that they have, if not better. It's only then a farmer is likely to take up that. The second is that it cannot compromise the yields and profitability for the farmer. So these are a given. Unless these are met, no amount of biofortified crop that we invest in can solve the actual problem. But I do think we have learned quite a lot from the work to date on what is needed, and now it is really doing it and learning from doing it as well in each of these contexts. For the consumer, then, will the consumer have it, even if the crop is there, it's in the market, or even in our, for example, a public distribution system, will people consume it, right? So obviously, this food that they then will make out of this crop has to meet various things that they are used to, right? Whether it is the color, the taste, smell, texture, cooking methods, etc., that we are used to, the consumer is used to, the new variety should be able to meet that expectation. Again, a lot of behavior change and demand creation activities do need to be invested in, but also development of new ways of cooking and demonstrations and getting communities involved in this process of growing these crops and consuming these crops. It's quite a lot of interesting set of issues that are doable, but we need to actually do it, sustainably over a period of time, so it becomes a habit for farmers and consumers.
So, India doesn't have a great diet. Indians don't have a great diet as it is. We know this. A recent report by ICMR has told us that 56% of disease burden in India is due to unhealthy diets. So, overall, we tend to pick up foods quite poorly. We tend to go for the fried stuff and for the snacks and for the sweets, which I'm not saying against. I mean, I'm one of those. I would pick a samosa over a vegetable any day.
We all love our samosas, don't worry. Yeah.
Yeah, that is one thing. But the other important thing is that fruits, vegetables, and all these nutritional foods are pretty expensive as it is. Given that food inflation in India always tends to be on the higher side, and it has been on the higher side for the past 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, can biofortified crops help reduce food prices so poor people or anyone for that matter can access them better?
Yes, that is the whole premise, right? That these crop, first of all, again, one of the things I wanted to say in when will the farmer buy it for to grow and when will the consumer buy it to eat is that the price points have to be similar to the staples that they buy. If cowpea is going to cost me more because it is biofortified, I'm unlikely to buy it. If the seeds are going to cost me more, biofortified seeds, I'm unlikely to take that risk. First of all, in the beginning, the farmer doesn't even know whether it is worth enough their while to take that risk. And higher prices for these seeds is not going to be they're not going to be incentivized to buy it. So the idea is that these crops and the seeds and the foods from those seeds need to be whether it's a rice or wheat flour or so on need to be available at the same price points. Otherwise, people are unlikely to pay higher amounts for these, and they will go to the usual varieties. You're right. And so, therefore, I do think biofortification has a huge potential because we can alleviate micronutrient deficiencies of these select but very important micronutrients in our diets. But remember that, we only know in nutrition, we only know about 40 nutrients and there are hundreds of them, right? There are many of them that we don't know much about. The fact is, people still will need to eat diverse amount of nutrient rich diets because they fight, for example, various kinds of cancers, right? We know that now. We are not going to fix all the antioxidant problems with biofortification is an extremely important tool, but we also alongside need to work on how do we make fruits, vegetables, and other animal source foods that are nutrient dense available to large parts of the population. So we are doing, and many others, of course, in India are also doing work on. This is actually termed as nutrition sensitive agriculture, which is now increasingly being recognized by our government. One is how can we make farms more nutrient diverse, and actually farmers grow varied nutrient rich crops. If they do that, ensure that they actually not sell all of it but to consume it. But even no farmer is capable of growing everything that they need every day on their farms, right? 80% of fruits, vegetables, and other kinds of animal source foods are sourced from the markets. So actually, we are working in Bihar and Orissa with the government, especially in Bihar with Jivika, for example, on trying to address this issue of how can we make local food markets work for nutrition of populations, especially nutritionally vulnerable populations. So that is definitely an important part of the puzzle, and biofortification is also that and an important part of the solution.
So finally, I like to ask you this. So if biofortified crops is one of the ways that can help improve our micronutrient intake, can biofortified crops as a whole, as a segment, and other issues, how can they make India nutritionally secure?
Absolutely. I mean, really scaling up these solutions, right? One is we need to ensure that our farms are producing, that means farmers are producing nutritionally diverse, rich foods, that they're consuming them. These include biofortified crops, definitely, as well, the area that we plant under biofortified crops increases, yields continue to increase, people and create a demand for the consumption of these foods while working alongside improving availability, affordability, and of these, and even desirability of these, you know, nutrient dense fresh foods. Basically, as you said, we all desirability is often is something we forget, right? If I have 1 rupee, well, you get nothing for 1 rupee these days. Say if I have 50 rupees, what do I choose to spend on? Do I spend on a few samosas and some sweets as a treat, which we all love, versus am I going to spend on 3 apples or whatever, right? So there is that trade off we are all making. All of us are making these trade offs. How can we nudge populations in a direction where they're more likely to choose apples versus samosas? Maybe they can reduce the number of samosas and increase the number of apples. So I think there's a lot of work that remains to be done, and that's something we are getting into, as I said, in our work on how do we improve the demand side while also improving the supply side of nutrient rich foods, including biofortified crops.
Thank you so much.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.